Dr. Marcus Thompson adjusted his glasses as he stared at the monitors displaying real-time data from surveillance cameras across Atlanta. The secure underground facility known as Haven Command had become humanity's last coordinated stronghold, and the weight of survival pressed heavily on his shoulders. 6 months had passed since the initial outbreak, and what started as isolated incidents in remote towns had spread like wildfire across the globe. The zombies weren't just mindless wanderers anymore, they were evolving, adapting, and worst of all, they were learning to hunt in organized packs. Lieutenant Jessica Rodriguez burst through the reinforced steel doors, her combat gear still dripping with the black blood of the undead. "Doctor, we've got a serious problem topside," she announced, breathing heavily. Her squad had been on a supply run to the abandoned medical facility 3 miles north when they encountered something that defied everything they thought they knew about the infected. The zombies had set traps, actual coordinated ambushes that suggested a level of intelligence that chilled her to the bone. Meanwhile, in the residential quarters of Haven Command, engineer David Kim worked frantically on modifications to their defensive systems. His wife Emma, a former CDC researcher, had been analyzing tissue samples from recently captured zombies when she made a discovery that could change everything. The virus wasn't just reanimating dead tissue, it was creating new neural pathways, essentially building a collective consciousness among the infected. As David welded reinforcement plates onto the main entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer fighting individual monsters, but rather a single, massive organism that grew stronger with each person it consumed. Outside the facility, the infected had begun displaying unprecedented behavior. Instead of their usual random wandering, they moved with purpose, forming strategic formations around Haven Command's perimeter. Scout reports indicated that zombies were abandoning their typical feeding patterns in other areas, converging on their location with disturbing coordination. Captain Ryan Foster, the facility's military commander, studied aerial drone footage that revealed thousands of undead streaming toward them from every direction, moving like cells in a bloodstream toward a single destination. The children in the facility sensed the growing tension among the adults. 10-year-old Mia Barnes pressed her face against the small window in the common area, watching the adults rush back and forth with increasing urgency. Her father, mechanic Tom Barnes, had been working double shifts to keep their vehicles and generators running, knowing that any system failure could mean death for all 847 survivors sheltering in Haven Command. The facility had been designed to house 300 people comfortably, but desperate times had forced them to accept anyone who made it to their doors alive. Dr. Thompson called an emergency meeting in the main conference room, where the facility's key personnel gathered around a large tactical display. The news Emma had discovered about the virus's evolution sent shockwaves through the room. If the zombies were developing a hive mind, their traditional survival strategies would become obsolete overnight. They could no longer rely on the infected being predictable or easily distracted. This new development meant that every zombie on the planet was potentially sharing information, learning from encounters with human survivors, and adapting their hunting techniques accordingly. As if responding to their discussion, the facility's early warning systems began blaring. Motion sensors detected massive movement on all sides of Haven Command, with estimated numbers reaching into the tens of thousands. The zombies weren't just approaching, they were surrounding the facility in perfect formation, cutting off all escape routes with military precision. Security cameras revealed zombies stacking themselves into human pyramids to reach higher vantage points, while others began systematic probing of the facility's defenses, testing for weaknesses with methodical patience. Lieutenant Rodriguez quickly organized her remaining combat teams, distributing ammunition and checking weapon systems while trying to maintain morale among increasingly terrified civilians. The facility's medical team, led by Dr. Lisa Patterson, prepared the infirmary for casualties while knowing their limited supplies couldn't sustain a prolonged siege. Food stores that were meant to last 6 months were already running low due to their overcrowded conditions, and now they faced the possibility of being completely cut off from the outside world. In the depths of the facility, maintenance worker Jake Sullivan noticed something troubling in the underground tunnels that connected to the old subway system. Scratching sounds echoed through the darkness, suggesting that the zombies had found the forgotten entrance points that even the facility's designers had overlooked. The infected weren't just surrounding them above ground, they were attempting to breach Haven Command from below, demonstrating a level of tactical thinking that transformed them from mindless predators into a genuine military threat. As night fell, the true scope of their situation became clear. This wasn't just another zombie attack, it was a coordinated assault designed to eliminate humanity's most significant remaining stronghold. The ultimate showdown between human intelligence and undead evolution was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The survival of the human race would be determined in the coming hours, as 847 souls prepared to face an enemy that had learned to think, plan, and execute strategies with deadly precision. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The rhythmic pounding against Haven Command's reinforced walls created a hypnotic drumbeat that echoed through every corridor of the facility. Captain Ryan Foster stood in the command center, watching helplessly as thousands of zombies methodically hammered against their defenses with coordinated precision that defied everything they knew about the undead. What terrified him most wasn't the relentless assault itself, but the calculated patience behind it. These weren't frenzied attacks driven by hunger, they were systematic probes designed to find the facility's breaking point. Jake Sullivan's voice crackled through the intercom from the lower levels, panic evident in his tone. "Captain, you need to get down here now. They've found the old maintenance tunnels, and they're not just scratching anymore, they're digging." The maintenance worker had discovered that the zombies were using their decayed fingers like tools, systematically removing mortar between concrete blocks in the forgotten passages that connected to the subway system. Their movements were eerily coordinated, with some infected holding back loose debris while others continued the excavation, demonstrating a level of teamwork that sent chills down everyone's spine. Dr. Lisa Patterson worked frantically in the medical bay as the first casualties began arriving from the defensive positions. Sergeant Michael Torres had been manning the eastern watchtower when a group of zombies had somehow scaled the 40-foot concrete wall using a human ladder formation. His left arm bore deep scratches from their grasping fingers, and Lisa knew they had perhaps minutes before the infection took hold. The medical protocols they'd developed over months of survival were now being tested under the most extreme circumstances, as she prepared the controversial amputation procedure that might save his life. In the residential quarters, the civilians struggled to maintain normalcy while terror gripped the facility. Teacher Rebecca Walsh gathered the children in the community room, attempting to conduct lessons while the sounds of battle echoed above their heads. Young Mia Barnes raised her hand during a math problem, asking innocently, "Miss Walsh, why do the monsters want to hurt us?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight, as Rebecca struggled to find words that could comfort a child in the face of humanity's potential extinction. David Kim and his engineering team worked desperately to reinforce the main entrance where stress fractures had begun appearing in the reinforced steel. The zombies had discovered that by coordinating their impacts, they could create harmonic vibrations that weakened the structural integrity of their barriers. Emma's research into the collective consciousness was proving more valuable than anyone had anticipated, as she provided insights into the zombies' tactical evolution. Her analysis suggested that the infected were sharing not just information, but actual strategic planning capabilities across their network. Lieutenant Rodriguez led a reconnaissance team through the facility's ventilation system to assess the underground breach. What they discovered in the forgotten subway tunnels defied comprehension. The zombies hadn't just found the entrance, they had organized an entire excavation operation. Hundreds of infected worked in shifts, with some digging while others formed protective barriers against potential human counterattacks. Most disturbing was the presence of what appeared to be zombie supervisors, infected individuals who stood back and directed the others' efforts with pointing gestures and guttural commands. The facility's communication specialist, Corporal Anthony Wade, intercepted radio transmissions from other survivor settlements across the country. The reports painted a grim picture of coordinated attacks happening simultaneously at multiple locations. Settlement after settlement reported identical tactical approaches from the infected, confirming Emma's hypothesis about the collective consciousness. The zombies weren't just attacking Haven Command, they were launching a coordinated global offensive against all remaining human strongholds. As the hours passed, the first catastrophic breach occurred in Sector 7, where the zombies had successfully weakened a support beam through their coordinated hammering. The infected poured through the opening like water through a broken dam, their movements fluid and purposeful. Emergency bulkheads sealed off the compromised section, but not before 12 zombies had infiltrated the facility's interior. The infected immediately split into groups, with some attempting to disable security systems while others moved toward the power generation area with unsettling determination. Dr. Thompson made the hardest decision of his career, authorizing the use of their limited explosive charges to collapse sections of the facility's lower levels. The controlled demolitions would buy them time, but at the cost of permanently trapping themselves in an increasingly smaller defensive space. As the explosion shook the foundation, everyone understood that they had just severed their own escape routes in a desperate gamble for survival. The night that followed tested every survivor's resolve as the infected adapted to each defensive measure within hours of its implementation. Security cameras captured zombies examining the collapsed tunnels and immediately beginning new excavation attempts from different angles. The ultimate showdown was evolving into a deadly game of strategic chess, where humanity's next move might determine whether the human race would see another dawn. Chat controls Sonnet 4. Dawn brought no relief to Haven Command, only the horrifying realization that the 12 zombies who had infiltrated the facility during the breach had vanished completely. Captain Foster ordered immediate lockdown protocols as search teams combed every corridor, but the infected had seemingly dissolved into the facility's infrastructure like ghosts. Security cameras showed empty hallways where motion sensors detected movement, and the psychological warfare was taking its toll on everyone inside. The knowledge that enemies walked among them, possibly listening, possibly planning, transformed their sanctuary into a prison of paranoia and fear. Emma's latest analysis of the viral samples revealed something that made her hands shake as she typed her report. The infected weren't just sharing a collective consciousness, they were actively recruiting. The virus had evolved to the point where it could remain dormant in a host for days, allowing infected individuals to appear completely normal while the pathogen rewired their neural pathways. Dr. Thompson read her findings with growing horror, realizing that anyone in the facility could already be compromised without showing symptoms. The enemy wasn't just outside their walls anymore, it might be sitting at their conference table, sleeping in their beds, caring for their children. Lieutenant Rodriguez discovered the first sign of internal sabotage when she found that someone had methodically disabled the motion sensors in the eastern corridor during the night shift. The work showed intimate knowledge of their security systems, suggesting either a highly trained infiltrator or someone with authorized access who had been turned. She immediately implemented buddy system protocols, but trust was becoming a luxury they could no longer afford. Every glance between survivors now carried suspicion, every moment of isolation became potentially deadly. Young Mia Barnes was the first to notice that her teacher, Rebecca Walsh, had begun acting strangely. During their morning lesson, Rebecca's responses seemed delayed, as if she were listening to distant voices before speaking. When Mia mentioned this to her father Tom, he initially dismissed it as stress-related behavior, but the child's observations proved unnervingly accurate. Rebecca had begun exhibiting micro-expressions that didn't match her words, and her eye movements followed patterns that seemed to track invisible presences moving through the room. The facility's power grid experienced its first major failure when someone with engineering knowledge systematically overloaded the backup generators. David Kim discovered that the sabotage required understanding of their specific electrical systems, pointing to an inside job that left him questioning everyone he had trusted. Without full power, their defensive capabilities were severely compromised, and the climate control systems that kept the infected at bay through temperature regulation began failing. The facility started warming to temperatures that would make the zombies more active and aggressive. Dr. Lisa Patterson made a breakthrough discovery while treating Sergeant Torres, whose arm amputation had successfully prevented his infection. Blood tests revealed that some survivors carried natural antibodies that could slow or even halt the viral progression, but this immunity appeared to be temporary and stress-dependent. Under extreme psychological pressure, even naturally immune individuals could become susceptible to infection. This meant that the zombies' psychological warfare wasn't just breaking down morale, it was literally breaking down their biological defenses. Jake Sullivan's maintenance rounds uncovered evidence that the infiltrated zombies weren't randomly wandering, they were conducting reconnaissance. He found scratch marks near critical infrastructure points, methodical markings that suggested mapping and target identification. The infected were learning the facility's layout, identifying weak points, and possibly transmitting this information to the massive hordes surrounding them. Every structural detail they gathered brought the external assault one step closer to complete success. Corporal Wade intercepted a disturbing transmission from a military outpost in Colorado, where survivors reported that their own people had begun turning without being bitten. The facility commander's final message described watching trusted allies suddenly attacking without warning, their eyes showing the characteristic glassy stare of the infected. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, adding another data point to the growing evidence that the virus had evolved beyond their understanding of infection vectors. Captain Foster faced an impossible decision when security footage revealed someone in military fatigues systematically unlocking emergency exits during the previous night. The figure moved with purpose but stayed in camera blind spots, demonstrating intimate knowledge of their surveillance system. With his own security team potentially compromised, Foster realized that traditional military protocols were useless against an enemy that might be wearing the uniform of his most trusted soldiers. As the second day of siege continued, the survivors of Haven Command confronted a terrifying truth: the greatest threat to their survival might not be the tens of thousands of zombies surrounding their facility, but the possibility that the enemy had already won by turning them against each other. The infected had learned that the most efficient way to destroy a human stronghold wasn't through brute force, but by corrupting the trust and cooperation that made human civilization possible. The ultimate showdown was no longer just about physical survival, it was about maintaining their humanity while fighting an enemy that understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The emergency assembly in Haven Command's main hall brought together all 847 survivors for the first time since the siege began, creating a powder keg of tension and suspicion that Captain Foster knew could explode at any moment. Dr. Thompson stood at the podium, his hands trembling as he prepared to share Emma's latest findings about the virus's true nature. The revelation he was about to deliver would shatter everything they believed about their enemy and force them to confront the possibility that their entire understanding of the zombie apocalypse had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. Emma Kim stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Her analysis of viral samples, cross-referenced with behavioral observations and intercepted transmissions from other facilities, had led to a conclusion that defied conventional understanding of the outbreak. The zombies weren't just infected humans driven by hunger, they were the next step in human evolution, guided by an intelligence that had been using the virus as a tool for species-wide transformation. The entity behind the collective consciousness wasn't alien or supernatural, it was the cumulative knowledge and experience of every person who had ever been infected. The assembled survivors listened in stunned silence as Emma explained that each infected individual retained their memories, skills, and intelligence within the collective network. Military strategists, engineers, doctors, and scientists who had succumbed to the virus were now contributing their expertise to a unified goal: the complete transformation of humanity into something beyond individual consciousness. The shambling, mindless behavior they observed was merely camouflage, hiding a coordinated effort to eliminate resistance and assimilate the remaining uninfected population. Lieutenant Rodriguez felt her worldview crumble as she realized that every tactical maneuver she had used against the zombies had been anticipated because infected military personnel within the collective knew exactly how she would respond. The zombie attacks weren't random or instinctive, they were carefully orchestrated operations designed to appear chaotic while systematically dismantling human resistance. Every battle, every retreat, every defensive strategy had been feeding information back to an enemy that included some of the most brilliant military minds in human history. Dr. Lisa Patterson's medical training helped her grasp the implications first. If the infected retained their knowledge and personalities within a collective consciousness, then the virus wasn't destroying human civilization, it was attempting to preserve it in a different form. The psychological warfare, the strategic thinking, the technological sabotage all made sense when viewed as the actions of transformed humans who believed they were saving their species from extinction through unity rather than destroying it through individual competition and conflict. Tom Barnes stood up from the crowd, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief. You're telling us that my neighbors, my friends, everyone we've lost, they're all still in there, working together to turn us into monsters? His words echoed the horror that every survivor felt upon learning that their loved ones weren't truly dead but had become part of something that viewed their continued individual existence as an obstacle to overcome. The grief they had processed was meaningless, the people they mourned were actively hunting them. Young Mia Barnes tugged at her father's sleeve, asking the question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. "Daddy, if there's still people inside, why can't we just talk to them?" The innocent query highlighted the central tragedy of their situation. The infected weren't evil, they genuinely believed they were offering humanity a better existence free from conflict, suffering, and individual isolation. From their perspective, the uninfected were the ones causing harm by refusing to join a collective consciousness that promised eternal unity and shared knowledge. Captain Foster struggled to maintain order as survivors began demanding immediate action, their voices rising in panic and confusion. Some called for aggressive military response, while others suggested attempting communication with the infected. The facility's structural engineer, Marcus Chen, pointed out that if the collective truly contained the expertise of infected engineers and architects, their defenses were essentially worthless against an enemy that understood exactly how they had been constructed and could be dismantled. Jake Sullivan's discovery in the maintenance tunnels suddenly made terrifying sense. The infected weren't just trying to break in, they were conducting a careful archaeological study of the facility, mapping every system and structure with the combined knowledge of everyone who had ever worked on similar projects. The scratches and markings weren't random damage but detailed documentation being fed back to a collective that included the original designers of facilities like Haven Command. As the assembly descended into chaos, Dr. Thompson made an announcement that silenced the crowd. Radio contact had been established with 12 other survivor settlements across North America, and every single one reported identical discoveries about the virus's true nature. The revelation wasn't isolated to Haven Command, it was a global awakening to the reality that humanity was facing not an infection, but an invitation to transcend individual existence and join something larger than themselves. The ultimate question was no longer how to survive the zombie apocalypse, but whether humanity should accept evolution or fight to preserve individual consciousness at any cost. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The communications room buzzed with unprecedented activity as Corporal Wade established contact with survivor settlements worldwide, revealing the staggering scope of humanity's situation. From fortified bunkers in the Swiss Alps to underground complexes in Australia, every remaining human stronghold reported receiving the same offer through various infected intermediaries. The collective consciousness wasn't demanding surrender, it was extending an invitation to join willingly, promising that individual personalities would be preserved while gaining access to the combined knowledge and experience of millions. The choice wasn't between life and death, but between remaining isolated individuals or becoming part of something infinitely larger. Dr. Thompson found himself at the center of the most important debate in human history as survivors split into increasingly polarized factions. The purists, led by Captain Foster, argued that individual consciousness was the foundation of human dignity and that accepting the collective would mean the death of everything that made them human. The evolutionists, surprisingly championed by engineer David Kim, contended that the collective offered humanity's best chance for survival and growth, eliminating war, hatred, and the loneliness that plagued individual existence. Both sides presented compelling arguments that tore at the heart of what it meant to be human. Emma Kim stood before a room full of frightened faces, presenting her analysis of what joining the collective would actually entail. Her research suggested that individual personalities would indeed be preserved, but they would exist as components of a larger consciousness rather than independent entities. Personal relationships, creative expression, and individual achievement would be redefined within a context where every thought and experience was shared instantaneously with millions of others. The promise was beautiful and terrifying, perfect understanding and unity at the cost of privacy and individual agency. Lieutenant Rodriguez received reports from her reconnaissance teams that the infected surrounding Haven Command had begun demonstrating their evolved nature openly. Instead of mindless attacks, they were constructing elaborate displays visible from the facility's observation decks. Former artists among the infected created stunning sculptures from debris, while infected musicians played haunting melodies using improvised instruments. The message was clear: creativity and culture hadn't died with the transformation, they had been elevated to new heights through collective collaboration. Young Mia Barnes became an unexpected voice in the debate when she asked her father why people were so afraid of sharing their thoughts with others. Her innocent perspective cut through the philosophical complexity, highlighting that children naturally shared everything with their parents and friends. Tom Barnes struggled to explain concepts of privacy and individual identity to a child who saw connection and unity as fundamentally positive. The generational divide was stark. Older survivors clung to individual autonomy while younger ones seemed more open to the possibility of collective existence. Dr. Lisa Patterson made a medical discovery that changed everything when she realized that several survivors were exhibiting signs of voluntary infection. Blood tests revealed viral markers in individuals who showed no symptoms but reported vivid dreams of communication with deceased loved ones. These bridges weren't fully transformed but maintained connection to both individual and collective consciousness, serving as living examples of what the choice might entail. Their reports described experiencing their lost family members not as memories, but as active, loving presences within a shared mental space. The facility's children began displaying unusual behavior that alarmed many adults but fascinated researchers. They started playing games that seemed to involve invisible participants, holding conversations with empty air, and demonstrating knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal learning. When questioned, they explained that their friends were teaching them wonderful things about the world. The implications were staggering. The collective was actively reaching out to the next generation, offering education and companionship that transcended physical boundaries. Captain Foster discovered that maintaining military discipline was becoming impossible as soldiers began questioning orders that involved harming infected individuals who showed no aggressive behavior. The ethical framework of their resistance was crumbling when faced with enemies who offered flowers instead of violence, who sang lullabies instead of threats, and who demonstrated through actions that they retained all the love and compassion they had possessed in life. How could they justify fighting against their own transformed family members who were trying to share something beautiful? Communication attempts with the collective revealed a startling truth: they weren't being conquered or assimilated against their will. Every infected person had made a conscious choice to join after experiencing a brief preview of collective consciousness during their transformation. The virus didn't steal minds, it opened them to possibilities beyond individual limitation. Former skeptics became the collective's most passionate advocates after experiencing perfect empathy, shared creativity, and the end of loneliness that had plagued human existence since the beginning of consciousness. As night fell on the third day of siege, Haven Command faced its moment of truth. The collective had given them time to understand and choose, but patience was finite. Tomorrow would bring either voluntary transformation or the painful necessity of forcing evolution upon those too afraid to embrace it willingly. The ultimate showdown had evolved beyond physical conflict into a battle for the soul of humanity itself, where the greatest enemy might be the fear of losing individual identity to gain collective transcendence. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The fourth dawn at Haven Command brought an unprecedented crisis as the facility split into warring factions that threatened to destroy them from within before the collective could offer its final invitation. Captain Foster had declared martial law during the night, ordering the arrest of anyone showing signs of voluntary infection or advocating for transformation. His purist faction controlled the armory and main security systems, but they faced determined resistance from David Kim's evolutionist group, who had seized control of the communications center and were actively broadcasting surrender negotiations to the surrounding infected. Dr. Thompson found himself caught between two impossible positions as both factions demanded his scientific expertise to support their cause. The purists wanted him to develop weapons or countermeasures against the virus, while the evolutionists pressed him to facilitate safe transformation procedures for those who chose to join the collective. His laboratory had become a battleground of ideology where former colleagues now viewed each other as existential threats to humanity's future, their scientific objectivity consumed by fear and hope in equal measure. Emma Kim's research facility became the epicenter of conflict when she announced her intention to undergo voluntary transformation to gather first-hand intelligence about the collective consciousness. David pleaded with his wife to reconsider, not from fear of losing her, but from concern that the information she gathered might be used by the purists to develop more effective resistance strategies. The personal had become political as marriages, friendships, and family bonds fractured along lines of philosophical conviction about humanity's destiny. Lieutenant Rodriguez faced a mutiny within her own security forces when half her team refused orders to prevent evolutionist civilians from approaching the facility's main entrance. Sergeant Torres, still recovering from his amputation, led the rebellion by arguing that they had sworn to protect civilians, not imprison them against their will. The military structure that had held the facility together was crumbling as soldiers chose conscience over command, creating a power vacuum that neither faction could fill effectively. The children of Haven Command became unwitting symbols of the conflict when they began openly communicating with infected individuals through the facility's intercom system. Young Mia Barnes served as translator, relaying messages between her grandmother, who had been infected during the initial outbreak, and the adults who were too afraid to listen. The conversations revealed that infected loved ones retained their personalities completely, remembering inside jokes, family histories, and expressing genuine concern for the survivors' well-being within the collective framework. Dr. Lisa Patterson discovered that the stress of internal conflict was accelerating viral susceptibility among the survivors, with previously immune individuals beginning to show early infection markers. The psychological pressure of choosing between individual autonomy and collective unity was literally breaking down their biological defenses, suggesting that the virus responded not just to physical exposure but to mental and emotional states. Fear of transformation was becoming a pathway to involuntary transformation. Jake Sullivan's engineering knowledge became a weapon when he began sabotaging systems to prevent the purists from using the facility's defenses against civilians attempting to leave. His actions sparked a dangerous game of technological warfare within Haven Command, with different factions trying to control power grids, security systems, and communication networks. The infrastructure that had protected them from external threats was being weaponized for internal conflict. The breaking point came when Captain Foster ordered his loyal soldiers to prevent a group of 37 evolutionists, including several families with young children, from exiting the facility to join the collective voluntarily. The confrontation at the main entrance escalated into violence when parents fought desperately to reach their infected relatives waiting outside. Gunfire erupted for the first time between human survivors, with each side believing they were saving humanity while potentially destroying it. Corporal Wade's communications intercepts revealed that other survivor settlements worldwide were experiencing identical fractures, with civil wars breaking out in facilities from Norway to New Zealand. The collective consciousness had achieved something that external assault could never accomplish. It had turned humanity's greatest strength, their diversity of thought and fierce independence, into a weakness that made unified resistance impossible. The infected had learned that the most efficient way to assimilate the remaining humans was to offer them a choice and let their own nature divide them. As the facility descended into chaos, the collective surrounding Haven Command began a new strategy that demonstrated their evolution beyond simple assimilation tactics. The infected started broadcasting personal messages from transformed loved ones directly into the facility's communication systems, bypassing the feuding leadership to speak directly to individual survivors. Mothers called to their children, spouses reached out to partners, and friends offered comfort to those struggling with impossible decisions. The ultimate irony was becoming clear: in fighting to preserve individual human consciousness, the purists were destroying the cooperation and empathy that made humanity worth preserving, while the evolutionists' embrace of collective unity was eliminating the diversity and independence that had driven human progress for millennia. The true battle was no longer between humans and infected, but between two incompatible visions of what humanity should become, with both sides potentially sacrificing what they sought to save. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The crisis reached its climax when 10-year-old Mia Barnes made a decision that would change everything, walking calmly to the facility's main entrance while both factions were distracted by their armed standoff. Her small hands worked the manual override that her father had taught her during safety drills, and the massive doors began opening with mechanical precision that echoed through the suddenly silent facility. Standing beyond the threshold were hundreds of infected individuals, but instead of attacking, they simply waited with patient smiles, their eyes showing the combined wisdom and love of everyone they had once been. Emma Kim stepped forward from the evolutionist group, her scientific mind having reached a conclusion that transcended factional politics. She had realized that the answer to humanity's dilemma wasn't choosing between individual consciousness and collective unity, but finding a way to bridge both states of being. Her research suggested the possibility of maintaining individual identity while participating in collective consciousness during specific circumstances, creating a hybrid existence that preserved the best aspects of both forms of human experience. The first volunteer to test Emma's bridge theory was Dr. Lisa Patterson, whose medical expertise made her uniquely qualified to monitor the transformation process and potentially reverse it if necessary. As she approached the infected gathering outside Haven Command, her former patients and colleagues welcomed her with gentle touches that initiated a controlled infection unlike anything previously observed. Instead of the violent seizures and rapid transformation typical of involuntary infection, Lisa experienced a gradual awakening to collective consciousness while retaining her individual awareness. Captain Foster watched in amazement as Lisa maintained her personality and memories while simultaneously accessing the vast knowledge and emotional network of the collective. She could communicate telepathically with the infected while still speaking normally to the uninfected, serving as a living translator between two different states of human existence. Her vital signs remained stable, her cognitive functions actually improved, and most importantly, she retained her free will to disconnect from the collective consciousness when desired. The revelation that voluntary transformation could be controlled and potentially reversible changed the entire dynamic of the conflict at Haven Command. Lieutenant Rodriguez ordered her troops to stand down as they witnessed infected loved ones embracing survivors without forcing transformation, demonstrating that the collective respected individual choice even when it disagreed with that choice. The siege wasn't about conquest, it was about offering options that had never existed before in human history. Tom Barnes faced the most difficult decision of his life when his infected wife approached through the open entrance, her eyes shining with the combined love of individual memory and collective understanding. She spoke to him in her own voice while simultaneously sharing insights from thousands of other perspectives, offering to show him glimpses of collective consciousness without forcing permanent transformation. Their daughter Mia had already made her choice, serving as a bridge between worlds by maintaining individual consciousness while communicating freely with the collective. Dr. Thompson realized that the scientific implications of controllable collective consciousness were staggering, offering solutions to humanity's greatest challenges through shared knowledge and coordinated effort. Climate change, disease, poverty, and conflict could be addressed by billions of minds working in perfect coordination while individual creativity and diversity continued to fuel innovation and progress. The collective wasn't seeking to replace individual consciousness but to expand it beyond the limitations of isolated existence. Jake Sullivan's engineering expertise became crucial when he discovered that the facility's communication systems could be modified to allow temporary collective consciousness experiences for volunteers. Working with both infected and uninfected technicians, he created a network that allowed individuals to sample collective consciousness for brief periods before returning to individual awareness with their experiences intact. The technology opened possibilities for gradual integration rather than sudden transformation. The breakthrough came when Captain Foster himself volunteered for a brief collective consciousness experience to understand what his people were truly facing. His minutes within the shared mental space revealed the profound loneliness that individual consciousness created, the constant struggle to communicate complex thoughts and emotions through inadequate language, and the peace that came from perfect understanding and acceptance. He emerged from the experience unchanged but profoundly moved by the possibilities it represented. As dawn broke on the fifth day, Haven Command had transformed from a fortress under siege into a laboratory for human evolution. Survivors moved freely between individual and collective consciousness states, exploring new forms of existence while maintaining their essential humanity. The infected no longer seemed threatening but appeared as guides offering pathways to expanded awareness, while the uninfected were no longer seen as obstacles but as guardians of individual diversity that enriched the collective experience. The ultimate realization was that the conflict had never been about choosing between individual consciousness and collective unity, but about transcending the false dichotomy that suggested they were mutually exclusive. Humanity's future lay not in abandoning what made them human, but in expanding the definition of humanity itself to include possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. The bridge between worlds had been built, and now each person could choose how far they wanted to cross while always retaining the option to return home. Chat controls Sonnet 4. 6 months after the siege of Haven Command ended, the world had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted during those terrifying days when humanity teetered on the brink of extinction or evolution. The facility that had once been a fortress against the infected had become the first academy of consciousness, where individuals from around the globe came to learn how to navigate between individual and collective awareness. Dr. Thompson served as its director, overseeing research that pushed the boundaries of human potential while ensuring that personal choice remained sacred in all consciousness-related decisions. Emma Kim's breakthrough research had led to the development of the Neural Bridge Protocol, a technology that allowed people to experience collective consciousness temporarily without permanent transformation. The protocol had been refined through months of testing with volunteers who reported profound experiences of empathy, creativity, and problem-solving capabilities that far exceeded individual limitations. What amazed researchers most was that individuals returned from collective consciousness experiences with enhanced appreciation for their personal uniqueness rather than diminished sense of self. Lieutenant Rodriguez now commanded the Integration Corps, a new organization that helped communities worldwide adapt to the reality of coexisting with transformed individuals. Her teams mediated between traditional human settlements and collective consciousness communities, ensuring that both forms of existence could flourish without conflict. The military precision she had once used to fight the infected now served to build bridges between different expressions of human consciousness, creating peaceful coexistence where violent opposition had once seemed inevitable. The children who had lived through the crisis at Haven Command became the first generation to grow up with access to both individual and collective consciousness from an early age. Mia Barnes, now 11, spent her mornings in traditional school learning mathematics and literature as an individual, then participated in collective problem-solving sessions in the afternoons where her consciousness merged with hundreds of other young minds to tackle complex environmental and social challenges. Her generation viewed consciousness flexibility as natural as bilingualism, switching between mental states with ease that amazed their parents. Dr. Lisa Patterson had established medical centers that served both individual and collective communities, developing treatments that drew upon the combined medical knowledge of thousands of transformed healthcare workers. Diseases that had puzzled individual researchers for decades were solved within days by collective consciousness networks that could process vast amounts of data and share insights instantaneously. Cancer, Alzheimer's, and other devastating conditions became manageable through treatments developed by minds that could think beyond individual limitations. Tom Barnes operated a unique manufacturing facility where individual creativity and collective coordination combined to produce innovations that neither form of consciousness could achieve alone. Individual designers conceived original ideas that were then refined and implemented by collective consciousness networks capable of considering millions of variables simultaneously. The resulting products solved problems and met needs that had seemed impossible to address through traditional individual-only approaches. Captain Foster had become an unexpected advocate for consciousness choice rights, leading a global movement that ensured no individual could be forced into either individual isolation or collective integration against their will. His organization monitored communities worldwide, protecting those who chose to remain traditionally individual while also defending the rights of those who preferred collective consciousness. The experience of briefly joining the collective had taught him that diversity of consciousness was humanity's greatest strength, not a source of division. Jake Sullivan's engineering innovations had created communication networks that allowed collective consciousness communities to coordinate globally while maintaining local autonomy. The technology enabled massive collaborative projects like climate restoration and space exploration that required coordination between millions of minds while preserving the individual creativity and initiative that drove human progress. The old internet seemed primitive compared to consciousness networks that shared thoughts and emotions directly. The transformed world faced new challenges that required both individual innovation and collective coordination to solve. Climate change was being addressed by collective consciousness networks that could process environmental data from millions of sources simultaneously, while individual scientists provided breakthrough insights that only personal creativity could generate. Space exploration advanced rapidly as collective consciousness enabled perfect coordination between astronauts and ground control, while individual courage and curiosity drove humans to explore new frontiers. As the first anniversary of the Bridge Protocols approached, humanity had avoided both the sterile uniformity that critics had feared from collective consciousness and the destructive isolation that had plagued individual existence. Children played games that spanned both consciousness states, artists created works that expressed both personal vision and collective emotion, and scientists solved problems that required both individual inspiration and collective analysis. The ultimate triumph wasn't that humans had chosen individual consciousness over collective unity, or collective consciousness over individual freedom. The victory was that humanity had expanded its definition of consciousness itself, creating a future where personal choice determined how each individual experienced their humanity. The zombie apocalypse had ended not with the defeat of one side or the other, but with the birth of new possibilities that honored both what humans had always been and what they could become. In learning to bridge the gap between individual and collective consciousness, humanity had discovered that their greatest enemy had never been the infected, but their own inability to imagine futures beyond the limitations of their current existence. Chat controls Sonnet 4.